Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Ever since the election, there's been two groups of black folks. The ones who are boldly proclaiming a new normal that the black vote has to be vied for and catered to just like everyone else. And the cowardly house Negroes who live only to keep Massa happy and are only too terrified at the prospect of Massa blaming them for Kamami's defeat. I think it's pretty obvious which camp you land in if you listen to me regularly. But the point is, the defeat of Kamala Harris is not a matter of black people who decided to vote for Trump. Those numbers are notable, but they're not the reason that she got taken down. The real reason she lost is that this election mirrored 2016. Black voters in those precious swing states stayed home. In fact, all of them stayed home from the looks of things. The white media spent so much time pouring endless concrete into the foundation of lies that Kamala Harris was on a roll, that Kamala Harris was a political rock star, that this woman had unbelievable momentum behind her. She just was going up and up and up and up and up in the polls. And I told you that was all a pack of lies. It couldn't possibly be true. And just like everything else the white media says, it wasn't. Nonetheless, that hasn't stopped the white media and a number of other bad actors from attempting a furious rewriting of the history books in the wake of her historic defeat. It's because everyone knows that once you acknowledge the reality that the black vote is the swing vote, then you also have to talk about meeting our demands. And in the current political dynamic, we've established that means reparations. Everybody has eaten off of our suffering, and that being the case, you got a lot of folks, many of them who are not classified as white, who don't like the idea of real justice, especially for black people. They don't like that at all. They prefer an unpleasant lie to a terrifying truth. So they claim that, it must have been those uncommitted Muslim voters who either stayed home or voted for the orange man. They must be to blame, or at least some contingent of it. But everybody knows it's the black vote. More of them have actually been saying that recently, at least in the last 24 to 48 hours. So what that tells me is there's probably some sort of half-brained maneuver underway where the Democrats are going to try to get their mojo back in time for the 2026 midterms because they've lost control of both houses of Congress. It's been made official today. The GOP retains control of the House of Representatives, just like I told you on election night. They weren't going to lose it, and indeed they didn't. Now, the reason that I began this morning's briefing with that is because people are trying to jump on our political claim, and that extends to far more than the tiny fringe elements whose votes are inconsequential, but who want to claim credit for what we've done anyway. You've heard me quote something that was said by your world, that America was founded by thieves, slaves, and opportunists. And right now, we're seeing the opportunists, as usual, trying to shoehorn themselves into what is our story. Same way we saw them doing it with hip-hop. All these folks who weren't even in the U.S. at the time claimed that they created something that most of them didn't even know existed. Now, when it comes to the 2024 election, there's also other elements who have been trying to find a way to use what we've done for their own personal benefit. In this case, I'm speaking specifically about the so-called men's rights activists. You probably heard me mention them a few times over the last 15 years, and the reason why is I don't have anything to do with these guys. Though I've noticed that there are some black men who have chosen to. Let me tell you something. Let's get this straight right off the bat. Whatever problems that you have in America as a black person, it's not because of any sort of gender issue. It's not because of misogyny if you're a black woman, and it's not because of so-called misandry if you're a black man. The issues that you have as a black person in this country are because of your race, not because of your gender, not because of your class, not because of your educational level, not because of your religion. It's because of your race, full stop. Now, you got a lot of black folks who it's hard to carry the weight of being black, and that's understandable. But they think that they're going to escape blackness by identifying themselves primarily by their gender or their sexual orientation or what have you. This is self-delusion, and it doesn't work. These so-called men's rights activists, they're only interested in themselves. So when they say men's rights, these guys are only talking about white men. They're certainly not talking about black ones. They hate Kamala Harris, but not because she did anything to them. She spent her entire life kowtowing to and bowing to white power. They hate her because there's this belligerent white nationalism that's been on the march for several years now and has become highly active the last few years in particular. And it depends on phony white victimhood to justify its egregious and often violent behavior. These guys have made it their entire calling card that they just mindlessly attack anything that's not a straight white male. And even if you are a straight white male, you gotta believe precisely the same thing they do, or you're the enemy too. They make a lot of noise. These white MRAs about how they think the politicians are ignoring their issues. But apparently they're so myopic they don't see that most of the politicians they're whining about are fellow white males like themselves. Now, when the Democrats began openly attacking black men as being sexist during this year's election, you had a bunch of these angry white male MRAs from Fox News to Reddit who became jealous of this. Why? Because they recognized that black men were getting the spotlight put on them specifically. And as far as these guys are concerned, the accusation of being sexist to them, that's a platform. That happens to be a soapbox for them to stand on. Black men were not trying to use it for that at all. We're not interested in having a war of words with anyone. But what they didn't like was the fact that what we had done was loud enough to be noticed. Something they failed to do completely. You never hear about these guys being mentioned in political campaigns at all, mainly because, as I mentioned before, it's kind of difficult for white males to claim that they're politically shut out when most of the country's politicians are white males. But the black voter revolt that black men kicked off and which black women have also been key to the success of, you had these individuals who didn't like the fact that black people together were loud enough to be noticed. Kamala Harris herself had to admit it and forced Barack Obama and his wife to have to come out of hiding and attack us as well. The Harris campaign didn't say that they had a Muslim voter problem. They already know that there's not enough of them to make a hair's bit of difference in the election. And they didn't say that they had a white male voter problem either. Didn't matter if you were a white male with a high education or none at all, which is what the white media talks about, but Kamala Harris wasn't. And the reason that they weren't talking about the white male problem was because the white males who were going to vote for Trump, they were going to vote for him regardless because of what they feel he represented to them and validated them. Now, you got certain of these MRAs who acknowledged that black men became front page news for the black voter movement that we kicked off. But these white MRAs are only mentioning black men as a cheap way to get some quickie attention for their own agenda, a rhetorical bait and switch. But what they're talking about has nothing to do with men in general, but only them. With the orange man set to retake office in a couple of months, you would think that the MRA types would be only too happy that he's going to be back in the White House and that they would be celebrating because their concerns are going to go from merely being front and center to now being fronter and centerer. But instead, they're whining that Congress isn't instituting measures specifically for them. These guys always point to things like child custody and alimony as being what they're so concerned about, but that's only the thin end of the wedge. If you've ever had the misfortune of going down one of their rabbit holes like I did this week, then you already know that when it comes to these MRAs and so-called red pill types, they use the alleged MRA rhetoric about fathers' rights as nothing more than a clumsy, very clumsy front for the same old white supremacist dogma. After they get through with their usual perfunctory and insincere chatter about child custody and alimony, when they talk about what really matters to them, you see that 99% of their talk has to do basically with thinly veiled racialist nonsense. These guys are nothing more than the male equivalent of the white feminist. Same way the white feminists are only concerned with what they think is going to benefit them, that's what these MRA types are about. These guys claim to be all about men's rights, but all it takes is a few moments of listening to what they say, and you see that they spout all the same anti-black talking points that you find on 4chan, Reddit, or any other white media sewer. They complain about the government taking their tax dollars and using them in ways that they don't like, talking about people leeching off the system. They talk about welfare and food stamps and other social safety net programs. But they never seem to spend any time on the fact that white people are the primary beneficiaries of welfare and food stamps in the U.S., but these white MRA types use all the dog whistles and coded language they can to infer that it's black people who they're talking about. It's black people who are the ones breaking the country's back, living off the government, and who the government is confiscating taxes to take care of. But even if white people were not the primary beneficiaries of social welfare, they're definitely the primary beneficiaries of corporate welfare, i.e. subsidies and other government money given to big corporations who don't even need it in many cases. And who are the heads and founders of these corporations? Not black people. So be it social welfare or corporate welfare, the MRAs, if they were intellectually honest, wouldn't be talking about black people at all. And the amount of money that the government gives to corporate welfare is far greater than what it gives to social welfare. But that doesn't get talked about either. These so-called men's rights activists were nowhere to be found when black men are being raked over the coals by the system. Same way the so-called guns rights contingent were nowhere to be seen when Philando Castile was murdered. He didn't have a gun, but he did have a gun permit, but that didn't save his life. And they weren't outraged about it. They didn't make a cause celeb out of him. They were too busy looking for some white homeowner or business owner who killed a black person in quote-unquote self-defense that they could stick up for. As black people, especially in the current climate, we're supposed to be smarter than to get sucked into any gender-warring nonsense. And I want you to also understand it's not just people who are from the Muslim contingent or other sectors of the electorate who are trying to take credit for what it is that we did. A lot of people are trying to figure out how they can hang on our coattails, how they can hijack the conversation and shoehorn themselves into it. And in the process, they hope that they'll be able to just squeeze us out. It's our job to make sure that they don't. So when somebody comes along with some phony pretend sympathy and pretending as if, oh, we see what it is the black guys are talking about and we're in agreement. No, they're not. Because if they were in agreement, then they would be talking about the need for reparations. They would be the main ones saying, well, you know what? Black men worked for hundreds of years in this country and didn't get anything except for lynched and killed. I think that justice demands reparations, because after all, if the slaves in the cotton fields had been black women, then, oh, wait. You see how stupid the whole gender warring thing becomes if you let yourself get sucked into it? These are luxuries that we cannot afford, so we're not going to waste our time on that stuff. The white contingent of the MRAs can be as salty as they want about the fact that black people in general and black men in specific got attention from the political establishment for the stand that we took. But the reality is we got that attention, A, because we have real dire concerns that are being ignored and that have to be addressed, and B, there is no substitute for the moral legitimacy that we represent. You're not going to come along with some astroturf movement being bankrolled by God knows whom, and all of this artificial attention that you're being given for issues that aren't even issues to begin with. You're not going to come along and do that and then think that it's going to take on the same importance and gravity that our movement does. Our movements have always been based on real and legitimate grievances, and never phony victimhood. That alone gives us a huge advantage over these artificial gripe fests that are being put on by people who the system has always benefited and always worked for the benefit of. So for any of the white MRA types who may be listening to this content, or any of their fellow travelers who may have stumbled here, if you want some pointers from this black man on how you could learn from what it is that black men did to bring attention to what we're saying and to be able to make it where we were actually front and center for the political discourse this election cycle, if you want to know how we did it and what you can learn from it, here's a tip. You can start by having yourselves laboring for other people for hundreds of years with absolutely no compensation, and have it where the individuals, will say that they're black in this case, declare that white people are not human beings at all, or only 3/5 human beings at best, and codify that into law, and then make it where every arena of the society bends over backwards and twists itself into pretzel knots in order to praise the very human beings who claim that you weren't human at all. And then afterwards, after you go ahead and put in your time for free in those cotton fields, then afterwards, let's go ahead and declare that we're going to give compensation to the black people who declared that you were not human beings because, well, you're not owed anything. And then after that, we'll have 150 years of lynchings, cross burnings, destructions of your townships. Make sure that you live in a state where all of the conditions that have been extant during your oppression in those cotton fields will also remain in place afterwards. And for the coup de grace, we'll go ahead and have a media that tells you that everything that happens to you is all your fault. It certainly can't be anything that these privileged black folks did to you, even though you, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents can recite chapter and verse how you had everything that you worked for stolen from you, and that you were demonized nonstop, and that you had a compliant government media working together to justify all of that. And then when you've had just about enough of the cross burnings and the destructions of your townships, you can go ahead and take to the streets and, we'll say, have a civil rights movement. And that being the case, you can watch as the politicians, black of course, cynically write laws saying that half of all black people should be considered for anything that you're eligible for. If there's going to be any sort of racial justice legislation, at least half of black people, we'll say black women in this case, have to be eligible for anything that a white person might be eligible for. Because after all, we're trying to balance the scales, right? And then for the following 50 plus years, we'll have a media, the black media, that says that, hey, everything's equal now. All of those sins of the past have been atoned for, and there's equal opportunity. And if you don't have what you think you're supposed to get out of life, well, it's your own doggone fault. We've gone ahead and buried all of those racialist practices. That's what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was about. That's what it was about, is make sure that there was no more of this blatant open discrimination. And then you can watch as the Justice Department finds that there's been redlining going on ever since the 60s, that it never stopped. All of the very things that you might have been protesting against that were holding you back as a white person was still in place. Now, if you can go through all of that, like black people have, then you too will be able to put together movements that have the moral strength necessary to get the kind of attention that you claim to want. But as long as you keep living a lie and claiming that you don't have privilege, which you clearly have, as long as you insist on repeating the lie that anti-black racism is nothing more than a figment of black people's imaginations, then you will never be able to do what black people have done. You can't traffic in phony victimhood and then expect the real victims of this society not to notice and not to call it out. So no, we're not letting anyone call themselves shoehorning themselves into this conversation. Nobody's going to come along and try to make any sort of claims that they've got anything in common with us. We're not letting anyone draw any sort of comparisons between themselves and us because there are no comparisons. And if there are any individuals who listen to me and still feel that maybe, just maybe, there might be something these MRA types are saying that you can agree with, just understand something. As far as I'm concerned, doesn't matter if it's an election year or not. We should all be in agreement that anyone who calls themselves trying to make a claim to our struggles gets a vote of no confidence from us. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: David Williams, Anton English, Monique Neely, Roxanne Allen, and Shannon Moore. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.